Another tragic story, this time almost half a decade in the making. After this young boy was murdered on Christmas Eve, investigators finally arrested a suspect. And as shocking as the crime against this little boy is, it's almost just as shocking who apparently carried it out. That's right, not just a family member, but this boy's grandma is now accused of his murder.
How do you capture what she did in one word?
Well, the word prosecutors used was torture, and from what they say, it really sounds like it. Here are just some of the claims against this grandma, who, by the way, had custody of not just this little boy, but his 3 siblings. And those other siblings are really the ones sounding the alarm and giving prosecutors some leverage to bring on the charges against grandma. And according to them, what grandma did was torture. Over the 2 years she had custody of these 4 children, she would allegedly starve them, withholding food for long periods of time. Investigators also say she forced them to run up and down the stairs, but it wasn't just for exercise. Apparently, she made these kids run up and down completely naked and wouldn't let them stop until they could no longer stand. The allegations get even more severe too, though, like forcing the kids to take freezing cold baths. And this is especially notable because the case takes place in New Hampshire, so you know they're getting some pretty cold winters. Grandma allegedly tortured these kids by making them take freezing cold baths, but on top of that, she also used to hold down their heads under the water. And during this 2-year stint where grandma had custody of these 4 kids, their biological mom was trying to regain custody.
Obviously, I feel bad for the children. I feel bad for mom. Don't feel bad for grandma.
That's trial lawyer Randy Kester, who's my guest today. But before we hear from Randy and his take on the case, let's familiarize ourselves with the facts. So here's our suspect, now 61-year-old Sherry Connor. She's the one who allegedly killed her 5-year-old grandson, Dennis Vaughan Jr., who his family called Boo. Grandma got custody of Boo and his 3 siblings back in 2017, and that was just the start of the nightmare. We already outlined some of the alleged torture she committed against these kids, but there's more. Keep in mind, this is still all alleged torture. She hasn't been convicted of any crimes yet, but prosecutors have a pretty strong case against her. They've got adult witnesses, neighbors, who say they saw the abuse firsthand. One neighbor, a man, said he actually had to move away because he couldn't stand watching the abuse, adding that Grandma Connor would stomp on the children. Another witness, a woman this time, said Connor preferred to straddle the kids and press a pillow over their heads to smother them. And this was apparently ideal because it wouldn't leave any marks. She did leave marks though, again, allegedly, on other parts of the kids' bodies, and as a failsafe, forced them to wear long sleeves in public so no one could see the scratches or bruises. She would apparently strike the grandchildren with a back scratcher, and one allegation says she even used an item that looked like a blowtorch. To top it all off, she also used hot sauce as a form of punishment and would pour it on the genitals of the male children. All of this is going on for years, allegedly until December 24th, 2019, that's Christmas Eve. Here's what prosecutors say happened. Grandma was mad that 5-year-old Boo left some of his clothes on the floor. So what does she do? She allegedly forces him to wear all the clothes that he hadn't put away and make him run in place in their kitchen. And again, keep in mind, this kid is 5 years old. So when this little boy could no longer stand, Grandma apparently got out a broom and started hitting him with it until the broom broke. Then she allegedly covered him up with a blanket and went on with her day. But the following day, Boo still hadn't gotten up, and by now, he couldn't control any of his bodily functions. He couldn't eat or swallow either, and was running a high temperature. Oh, and he was also hallucinating. Prosecutors note that during all this, Connor never called for emergency help. When law enforcement finally got involved in the case, Boo was unresponsive and later pronounced dead. A medical examiner said his cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and neck, and the cause of death? Murder. So now you're kind of up to speed with the alleged crime. So let's bring back Randy Kessler. Here's his initial thoughts on the case.
You know, the same thing goes through my mind every time I see a story like this, which is what could society have done? What could we have done? What could the government have done? And it always comes down to the Department of Family and Children's Services in a certain state. Why didn't they do more? And you only hear about those companies and those organizations when there's a mistake. And that's terrible because they're really working hard, but it's usually underpaid people that are overworked. And there's so many competing interests, right? the person watching the child doesn't want to be intruded upon and saying, let me do my job, I'm taking care of the child. And the out parent, in this case, the mom of the children, is saying, but you need to protect my children. And these departments are always stuck in the middle. And I'm just thinking, what could they have done better? Obviously, hindsight's 2020. Maybe they should have taken the children away from grandma earlier. Maybe they should have put more resources into it. It's easy to look at it like that in hindsight, but it's just sad for me because I know there are not enough resources to devote all the time, money, and expense that it would have taken to properly protect these children.
Honestly, this story, Boo's story, is really hard to talk about. It's very tragic and the details are horrific. But I do think it's an important story to tell. And one of the reasons I'm able to tell you this story is because of our sponsors. That's products like City Lips. Now, I recently started using City Lips, and honestly, I really like it. For a while, I was super into matte lipstick, which honestly, let's be real, it looks really cool. But the downside is that your lips are always dried out. When I turned to City Lips, things changed a bit because the moisture factor, when you put on this lip gloss, your lips are completely moisturized. And the cool part is there's so many different colors to choose from, so it doesn't matter the occasion or how you're feeling, there's always gonna be the right one for you. Right now, you can get 15% off City Lips with the code LAW15, or you can go to citybeauty.com/LCnews. And let's jump right in with the question everyone is wondering. If we're going back to the actual crime itself, this little boy died 5 years ago now of blunt force trauma to the head and neck, and it was ruled a homicide pretty shortly after his death. So why would it take this long for an arrest of the person we knew was there when the boy died?
So there are a lot of reasons, right? We can't just arrest somebody based on supposition or totally circumstantial evidence. You have to feel like not only that the person did it, but that you can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, because the last thing they want to do is arrest somebody and lose the case. So they had to wait until they had some good evidence. And it's going to be interesting, Sarah, to see what the evidence is. Was it one of the children spoke up? Was there an admission? Did grandma say something to somebody that I wish I hadn't hit him so hard? There's going to be some smoking gun that made them feel more confident. And of course, 5 years is a long time. Memories fade. If it's a child witness, the child might have been a lot younger and now they're older. So is their memory credible? But I'm not shocked that they didn't make an arrest immediately because, again, it would be grandma's word against everybody else. Who else is there except a bunch of minor children, that might have been mad at grandma for not letting them have dessert or might have had some motivation to say something bad. So it's not surprising that it took that long. Better late than never.
Again, this happened all the way back in 2019, and Grandma Sherry Connor was arrested on August 16th of this year. That's almost 5 years later. It all started with a grand jury indictment in Belknap County, New Hampshire. She was indicted by a grand jury, and this is something that is somewhat complicated for me, so I know viewers might be struggling with it at times too. This is interesting because it's completely closed doors. The media isn't in there. We don't know what happened. It's a secret hearing, but she was indicted. So what do you think, if you can explain the grand jury a bit, what happened to yield in her charges or indictment?
So you can put a lot of information in front of the grand jury. And, the fact that this jury of community members listened to all the potential evidence and decided that they had enough to move forward on is very powerful. It's better than a prosecutor just saying, yeah, I've talked to a witness, I'm going to charge somebody. So, they've actually had to prove their case, not to the highest standard of the law, not to beyond a reasonable doubt, but just to get an indictment, just to get the people on the grand jury to say, this lady needs to be charged and brought before a jury of her peers to stand charges. So, we don't really know what was in there. It also gives the prosecution a good chance to say, wow, that evidence was really powerful. That evidence wasn't powerful. So they sort of get to pre-try their case. And they see how witnesses act. They see how the evidence affects the jurors when they're in there. Grand jury is a good testing ground, but certainly if a grand jury gives an indictment, prosecution has to feel good about their chances of getting a conviction.
So we don't know what happened or what evidence was presented to that grand jury, but we do know some of the evidence, at least, that was presented at her first televised hearing. And prosecutors kind of laid out what had happened to the young boy. They said he had more than 60 contusions and abrasions on his body, and 28 of those were on his head alone. So this is serious injuries to this boy. But they just kind of sprinkled in a little bit of the evidence at this initial hearing. So if this is going to move on to trial down the line, do you think there's more evidence that they're kind of keeping close to the vest for now that they would later unveil at the trial?
Certainly, I think, showing how, that's not a one-time slip and fall. That's not oh, the child fell. That's repeated over and over conduct. Of course, they have to tie that to grandma, and there's got to be somebody tying it to grandma. I'm imagining it's one of the other children saying, yeah, I'll tell you how his head had those bruises. Grandma used to take this, heavy hammer or spoon or whatever it is. There's something tying that to her, or they wouldn't be moving forward. You have to have some sort of proof. You can't just say, yeah, it smells like grandma did it, so we're going to just put her up and put her on trial for her life. That's too circumstantial. Although, if they didn't have anything else, then they probably would have tried that a long time ago. I'm glad they waited. I'm glad they've got a witness. And yeah, I think grandma knows she's going away for a long time.
At that first public hearing of Connor's, prosecutors laid out those stark abuse allegations we were just talking about. Prosecutors outlined some of the horrific things that this grandma allegedly did. I mean, some of the things were holding their heads underwater, putting hot sauce on their genitals, denying them food and water, making them run up and down the stairs naked. Okay, so prosecutors called this torture in her first appearance that we were able to see televised. Would you agree with that it was torture of these children?
I think it's the right word to use to get the judge's attention, to let the judge know how bad this was. How do you capture what she did in one word? The other thing that's interesting, Sierra, is this is not after the fact, let's find a reason to arrest her. This is stuff that mom was concerned about even before the child's death, and there were all sorts of activities. So it seems like it's more of the same. You just may now have children that are willing to talk about it, old enough to be able to convey their thoughts. And again, I'm sure the prosecution feels like they will be believable because of the way they present, and they've seen them, they've seen their statements. That's important. Is a jury going to say these are just children that are angry at their grandma, or is it children that were really suffering? It sounds like, especially when there's more than one witness, it sounds like grandma's got a hard road to hoe. Plus, they could look for a plea. Now that grandma knows what could happen to her, she's old enough that even a plea is going to put her away for a long time. So, but she may avoid, who knows? She may avoid a lifetime sentence. She may get 5-10 years if she pleads guilty. I don't know how strong the evidence is. I would imagine it's pretty strong. I imagine that the prosecution's in a tough place. If they give her any kind of plea, then they're going soft on crime. So I'm sort of guessing this is going to be a trial, even if grandma decides I want to plead guilty.
So this abuse, once again, is still just alleged at this point, but those allegations are what led to what Connor is now up against. Zeroing in on the charges that she now faces, there's a slew of them. I mean, second-degree assault, 4 counts of witness tampering, 6 counts of first-degree assault, and then, of course, there's negligent homicide. So here on Law and Crime, I mostly cover first-degree, sometimes second-degree homicide or murder. But what is the difference here that it's negligent homicide?
So negligent homicide is sort of the easy safety net that if they can't prove that she, overtly did this, that she intentionally went after the child and tried to hurt the child and kill the child, or at least tried to hurt the child and then it resulted in a death, they can have the negligence. If it's such a wanton disregard for the safety of others, if she put the child at the top of the stairs without a child gate and knew the child might fall down the stairs, that might warrant negligent homicide. It certainly is a personal injury case, right? If she was negligent, you just have to tip the scales that she wasn't protective enough of the children. But to get negligent homicide and make it a criminal, you have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, that it was such negligence, such horrible negligence, that she should have, or a reasonable person should have known this would result in the death. But again, that's easier to prove than that grandma actually wanted to harm her grandchild. So they always put that in. That's a nice little safety net that if you can't get them on murder one and intentional murder, you get them on negligent murder, negligent homicide.
A big part of this case is the passage of time between Boo's death and Connor's arrest. But in the years between these two major events, there was a lot of discussion about Boo's treatment. There's even a Facebook page called Justice for Dennis Boo Vaughan Jr. And for years before Connor's arrest, people posted on the page and even had public events to promote justice for Boo. Someone who has really been outspoken about all this is Danielle Vaughan, Boo's mother. She pointed the finger at the State Division for Children, Youth, and Families. She says she was trying, and this part is a quote, to terminate guardianship through courts to regain custody of her children from her mother at the time of her son's death. Danielle has since brought on a civil lawsuit against the Division of Children, Youth, and Families, and in that suit, she cites more than 25 reports of suspected abuse and neglect, all at the hands of Grandma Connor. Let's remember, at the time of Boo's death, he was only 3.5 feet tall. He only weighed 43 pounds. So this is a small little boy who, when investigators found him, had dozens of cuts all over his body, and Grandma is apparently the one who put them there. What sort of defense do you think that she could bring forward then? Because these are obviously some horrific crimes, and against children are some of the most severe. So jurors, if this does go to a trial, have to hear about this alleged abuse for multiple years, and then the death of this 5-year-old boy that was obviously horrific and traumatizing for his siblings. So what sort of defense could she even have in a case like this?
It's hard to mount a defense without an alternate explanation. What's the other reason this child died? If it wasn't her, if she's not going to testify that the child fell or that the child got attacked by a gang of people who broke into the house, if she's not going to explain that, the only other defense is to challenge the credibility of the witnesses and to say these children didn't like being punished, didn't like being disciplined, and that they have it in for Grandma. But there's really not much of a defense. I think the defense is prove your case. You've got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and you were too young to really have a good memory of it. And I was there taking care of you all, and that's it. And if you think I did this, then go ahead and put me in jail because I didn't do it, and I don't have any way to explain that I didn't do it. But I don't have the burden as a grandma to prove I didn't do it. They have the burden to prove that she did do it. And you're going to have these minor children saying that Grandma did this. That's about the only defense she has that I can think of without seeing the evidence.
So we talked about the defense, and there's also motive. Obviously, this isn't something that prosecutors are required to have in order to prove her guilt, but it's something that I'm always interested in. I'm sure that jurors are interested in. Why would this have happened? Do you think that prosecutors or investigators would look into her motive to have committed, allegedly, these crimes?
Well, first of all, I think you're exactly right, Sierra. They don't have to prove it. And I think the prosecution is going to make very clear in the closing arguments that we do not have to prove a motive. We have to prove that she did it and it caused the death. So we do not have to prove motive because you're right. It's sort of hard to prove that a mother would kill their child, much less a grandmother would kill their grandchild. So that is a burden that, is inherent in this kind of trial. But what is the motive? I don't think it's so much that she intended to do it and was premeditated. I think it was she didn't care and she intended to cause the act that ended up causing the death. She thought it was okay to punish a child. She thought it was okay to discipline a child. What else would there be except that, I'm entitled to treat them as I wish because I'm taking care of them and I'm doing everything for them. I can decide. I'm the judge, jury, and executioner. I'm their government. I'm their emperor. I get to decide how things happen because I'm in charge. And that's more of the motive that I think is going to be there. I don't think it's going to be very hard to say Grandma wanted to kill her grandchild. I would not bank my case on that if I was the prosecution.
In talking to Randy Kessler here, it seems like prosecutors have a pretty strong case against Grandma. And a lot of that evidence comes from the kids who saw all of this abuse happen. If we're talking about the witness or witnesses, they seem to be the key ones for the prosecution, which would be these 3 other siblings who Grandma also had custody of. This is where things get a little tricky because obviously this is alleged abuse against these children. So it could be pretty traumatizing for them to relive, but their testimony is very important for the case. So how would that work with prosecutors? Would they hope to bring these kids on the stand to testify? We're unclear their ages exactly, but obviously under the age of 18, a lot of pressure on these kids. So how would all of that work?
Well, that's probably the only reason the prosecution would consider a plea deal is to not re-traumatize the children, especially since it's been so long since they've gone through this, and not have them subject to cross-examination and don't you have a bone to pick with Grandma and all those kind of things. Again, another silver lining is that it's not just one witness. There are 3 children that can all sort of have group therapy in the lay sense and in a professional sense. They can go to therapy together, and they've got each other to lean on. I'm not crazy. Did I make this up in my head? No, you saw it too, and we all saw it together. I think that's helpful for them. I think it's powerful. I think prosecutors are going to try to bring the strongest witness first. Sometimes you see pleas in the middle of trial. But if grandma's willing to spend the rest of her life in jail and take a plea to save the children this trauma, good for her. That'd be the one good thing she did. Also, apparently, she's pretty ill, so any kind of sentence is probably a life sentence for her anyway. But I think prosecutors may very well, for that one reason, maybe that one reason alone, think about a plea deal that saves the children the trauma of having to testify. But you know what else, Sierra? In some cases, testifying against your abuser can be cathartic and can be therapeutically beneficial. I'm not a psychologist, but from what I understand and what I've read, sometimes being able to have that confrontation is a healing moment, getting to address that person and look them in the eye and hold them accountable. So there may be some benefit to the children to that. Again, I trust the psychologist in this situation.
At Connor's first public hearing this month, her defense noted she has no prior criminal history, but also that she has cancer in both her throat and chest. But what does her illness have to do with an ongoing court case?
I think that goes more to sentencing. The only other question is, if it comes up, does it give the jury any sympathy towards her? But if she doesn't testify, how do they get that in? How do they mention that? I guess they could find ways to get it in. They could call other witnesses, but unless it's a defense to what she is accused of doing, that she was mentally out of her mind and not thinking straight, and in some sort of insanity defense, I don't think it's terribly relevant. Having cancer doesn't give you carte blanche to murder or abuse children. So I think it's an issue more for sentencing. And it may be that at the time of sentencing, her cancer is worse, and instead of in jail, she goes to a hospital until she can get that treatment or until she passes. But I think it's more of a punishment type of situation. I don't think it excuses her conduct, and I think shame on her if she uses that as a defense, unless it did affect her mindset and her mental capacity. But 5 years she's been functioning independently since this incident. It's going to be hard to claim she was incapacitated for a brief moment, because why didn't she do anything about it afterwards? Why didn't she get help afterwards when she realized what she'd done or what she's doing to the other children? I think it's interesting, but I think it goes more to sentencing and what happens after she's convicted.
So Kessler's wondering if Connor's diagnosis comes up at a potential future trial, could it get some sympathy from jurors? It's possible, but so far it hasn't gotten any sympathy from the case's judge, even this early on. We're still pretty early into this case. I know that's kind of a weird thing to say because the crime happened 5 years ago, but she was just now indicted recently this month. So kind of early in the case in a way. And at her first hearing, the judge denied bail. She is not allowed out as of now. What do you think about that? Do you think it's appropriate?
I do think it's appropriate. I think she should get medical treatment if she needs it. She's innocent until proven guilty. But when you have a person who might feel like, I'm going to die anyway, and we've had other cases, you've covered other cases where people are sick. Grandma says, I'll do anything for my son and I'll go kill his girlfriend, or, who knows what she's going to do if she feels like her life is over anyway and she's out of jail. I think in this case, it's probably the right call to keep her in jail until the case comes to trial. But again, I'm not there. I don't know the evidence. Is an ankle bracelet, is home monitoring appropriate? Maybe. The main thing is we want her to be held accountable if she's guilty, but we want to preserve her rights to be innocent until proven guilty. And she does have a clean record, so to speak, until this. She's not a convicted felon who's out on bail and then did this and should be right back in jail. So it's a tough balance for the judge, but you've got to just feel the moment when you're the judge and say, on one hand, God forbid I let her out of jail and she doesn't show up for trial, then I've failed this family. On the other hand, this is an innocent woman until proven guilty. Why should I keep her in jail? It's a tough balance, but I think until the judge knows more, for now, keeping her in jail was probably the right call.
So we've touched on what could happen if this potentially goes to a jury trial. We've also touched on the possibility that there could be a plea deal. What do you think is ahead in the case? Again, we're still early in terms of hearings and court appearances, but what would you anticipate?
I think her lawyers are going to have some serious, tough discussions with her. They get to see the evidence. They're going to see what the state has. They're going to figure out what their chances are at trial. And assuming they're as bad as the state thinks they are, they're going to have a tough conversation with her that says, the question is, do you want to go to jail for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Let us try to get the best deal we can. And if the prosecution feels really good about their case, the only reason they would cut a deal, like I said before, is because the children don't want to have to get on the witness stand or are asking not to get on the witness stand. But it sounds like at this point in time, the children have come forward. They're probably willing to testify. Again, there might be some catharsis to it. I imagine it's going to be a trial. The other reason she might want a trial is because it prolongs the inevitable. If it looks like she's got no hope and she's going to be a convicted felon and convicted of murder of her grandchild, at least a jury trial isn't today. If you plead guilty, you're guilty today. If you don't plead guilty today and you wait for a jury, then you're innocent for another few years or another few months of your life. And we've seen people do that know they're going to be found guilty, but they'd rather have a jury tell them they're guilty than tell the whole world that they own it and they did it. That way she can always say, well, the jury got it wrong or the judge made a mistake, and she can proclaim her innocence. It's hard to get inside the head of a defendant, but she doesn't have any easy choices. It's either agree that I did this and spend most of my life in jail, or take my chances with the jury and probably with the same result.
We know that Connor is being held without bail now, but she'll have a chance to revisit that at an upcoming evidentiary hearing. Meanwhile, Boo's mother now has regained custody of all 3 of his siblings. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.